I'm Hagar Goldberg. I'm a neuroscientist. It's actually a funny way how I got there into neuroscience because I started studying biology and animal sciences. I thought that I'm going to be a vet. That was my original plan. But then into my studies, I realized that I'm actually much more passionate about brain studies. And I took more and more courses in neuroscience. And then I decided to change my original plan and go to grad school studying neuroscience. And then during grad school, I started more and more focusing on the human brain and cognitive neuroscience. And then by the end of my PhD, I was starting to be very focused on the intersect between the human brain and human learning, and especially this gap between what we know about the brain and how the brain processes information and learn information, and how differently we teach. And we practice teaching and learning. So I was really interested in closing this gap and teaching people the way the brain learns and teaching people about the brain in order to give them the power to understand themselves better and to be more guided and independent, I guess, in their development and educational path as well. As a neuroscientist, I'm affiliated with the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. These days, I mostly teach. I teach neuroscience and mostly to undergrads. And the reason that I chose this age group is because I think it's just an amazing opportunity to meet people when they're very young and their brain is still developing, because my students, they're early 20s. So their brain is still developing. And by teaching them neuroscience and making the connections to their own lives and development, they can actually transform and can use this knowledge to shift their own developmental trajectory. So this is something that I'm very, very passionate about. Neuroscience is the research study of the brain, and it's a bridge between many different disciplines, including, for example, biology, computational science, physics, math, psychology, even philosophy. So it's a really interdisciplinary field, which is one of the things that I find most exciting about being a neuroscientist. And of course, the main goal, the main question, what is and why is and how is the brain is very fascinating. So neuroscience is all about studying the brain. This can be from the smallest molecules and the basic building blocks of our brain. So, for example, the basic nerve cells, neurons or glia cells, and what's going on inside them and between them. So this is a lot of biochemistry and molecular biology, for example. And then we can, zoom out to different levels. We can study the network level, and then the systems level, because there are many functional systems in the brain. And we can study the brain as a whole, and we can even study the brain in relation to other brains, so interactions between different brains. This is the social level of brain study. And of course, there are also like the medical perspective of neuroscience and so on. There are so many, it's such a huge field, and it touches so many other disciplines. So the way I see it, and the way I also experience that personally by studying the brain, is that as you learn more and more about the brain and you go and dive into that, it's like a black box that suddenly you have access to see what's inside, and you get to see the inner machinery of our human experience. You understand all the underlying mechanisms and processes that build experience and thought and feeling and behaviors. And it's not just understanding or seeing what we do or what we say, it's really understanding why. And I'm all about chasing the why and understand why things are the way they are. But the other side of it is that with this profound understanding, we also get some, I think, some more influence or more access to affect this machine, to be an active part in how these things happen. We can shape some of the processes. We can, it's becoming like a dialogue with your own brain. So you can train your brain to do some things. You can train your brain to think differently. And I think this is very, very powerful. I believe that stories are very important, and by stories I mean mainly our inner voice and the stories that we tell ourselves, about who we are. The way our brain works is that it's process information, and we are like a meaning-making machine. And the way we create meaning is through connecting between many different pieces of information. And there is also the time dimension. So our brain connects between our past and present and future or thinking forward to create this continuous identity. So it's all about stories. And the way in our stories, once we have some kind of story that we internalize and start to rolling in our head, it really affects the way we feel about ourselves. It affects our physiology. For example, if I have a story that is very stress-oriented, then it will affect my entire physiology. My body and brain will be always in alert mode. I will be very cautious, and I will start to perceive the world around me from a very cautious way. So our stories are like filters on how we see and interact with our environment, and what our brain makes from the information around us. The stories that we carry, they're like prerequisite to the future stories that we'll have. Once we have some kind of tendency somewhere, this is a projection that can last our entire lives. But when we know the power of stories and how they sink into our identity and shape our core, and then become this physical reality, they are imprinted in our brains, they affect our physiology, they affect how we show up in the world. Once we know that, we can also be the driver behind the wheels of the story. And maybe just to understand, more concretely, to understand what I'm talking about, I can share that personally, part of my story growing up is that I was too sensitive. As a child, I received these messages, mostly implicit. So it's not that people constantly told me, but it was very clear that I am the sensitive child and I'm too sensitive. It's like too much, and it might be a weakness, and I might be too fragile because I'm so sensitive. So, and this is something that starts rolling in your head. And so I really try to toughen up, and I try to really ignore my feelings or suppress my feelings, or in a way I learned or internalized that feelings are noisy distractions. And then actually through research and learning about the brain, for example, it really shifted my perspective, and I understood that, yes, I am sensitive, which introduced some vulnerability, but it also the source of my greatest assets. And while I need to be careful sometimes, being so sensitive, I'm not supposed to suppress or ignore my feelings. I have to actually listen to them, because these are my sharpest and most reliable sensors. And I learned that that feelings are data. And I taught myself to use this information and feeling and my sensitivity in a whole different way. So this is, I think, an example of how we carry some stories from our past, and we can choose later to rewrite the story and to decide what to keep and what to let go of. And we also have a say in that story. Neurodiversity is, well, it really depends which lens we take on this. But as a neuroscientist, I take the cognitive neuroscience lens. So if you imagine all the human brains in the world, and we measure how similar they are to each other. So first of all, we'll find vast similarity across all brains, both of neurotypical and neurodivergent individuals. But then most of the people will be more similar. So 80% of the population will see a lot of similarity and very little diversity. And in the tails of this distribution, we'll see individuals or brains that usually during development have shown this deviation from the norm. So their brain development and some systems of the brain and some regions of the brain show significant differences. So this is like a spectrum. We all express some diversity, meaning all of our brains are very similar, but not identical. And each one of us shows some diversity to some extent in our brain. And this is kind of like the fingerprint of our brain, if you want. But some of us express more diversity, and some levels really depends on the extent of the diversity and also the type of the diversity. But sometimes this will show behaviorally. So the diversity really will affect the way the person process information, the meaning-making process of a person, how sensitive they are to sensory stimulation, the way they tune their attention, the way they communicate with people. Some cases, this will reach what we call the clinical threshold. So sometimes neurodiversity will be diagnosed as a clinical condition. So I think the main categories that are today considered as neurodiversity are autism spectrum disorder, attention disorders, so ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, learning disabilities, so dyslexia, for example. Sometimes under this umbrella, we also consider acquired neurodiversity, which is, for example, diversity that is caused due to the recovery from brain injury. So the brain recovered through neuroplasticity in different ways, and the result is a rewiring of the brain that is different it's atypical, it's different from the typical. And psychiatric disorders, so schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, clinical depression, anxiety, things like that. So these are all examples of expressions of neurodiversity. So I think there is so much stigma and misconception around neurodiversity. So first of all, I like to get the facts right, to really explain what is neurodiversity from the brain perspective. Why is neurodiversity? The fact that it's not a bug, but a feature It's something that has been there for many generations, and actually for a long time in our evolution. And it's this diversity was kept and preserved and survived natural selection. So it's not like, mutations that or mistakes that happened. It's actually something very intentional and natural. There are a lot of benefits for diversity. And many times it should not be considered as pathology, although in the names that I just mentioned, like by definition, they are defined as pathologies. If you think about it, like autism spectrum disorder, learning deficiencies or disabilities. But in fact, many of these cases can turn from a disability to a difference if the responsibility would be on our system and not just the individual. So in other words, I mean, a child, for example, a student that has that express some neurodiversity, that is a neurodivergent student, in many cases can be very successful. And I say it's like firsthand, like some of my most brilliant, successful students are students that are diagnosed as neurodivergent. But given the right conditions, so if the system will be more flexible and accommodating different styles of learning and thinking, then we can allow and support more people to break through and succeed and fulfill their potential. So sometimes it's not that the person is disabled, it's us, the system, that is disabling. So this is kind of my take on neurodiversity, and this is how we're going to unpack it in the course. I just want to say that it does not say that any neurodiversity is just something that we need to celebrate as a difference and does not require treatment or things like that. There are definitely cases of neurodiversity that require treatment and cure and prevention and research, and we'll actually work through identifying between the different cases and what it requires from us as a society. Personally, I'm very passionate about what I'm doing and about studying and teaching neuroscience. For me personally, neuroscience is really like the perfect package that kind of include many of my interests and skills and expertise, but also humanistic values. So it's the best combination of science, and I think science to me, the most interesting thing in the world, which is the brain. But there is a lot of, I think, humanism, if you really look for it. There is a lot of humanism in neuroscience. And teaching people about the brain and making these connections, these explicit connections between this like hardcore science to their own lived experience is like magic. I love to see those like insights and like light bulbs like appearing above my students' heads. I'm like, oh. So it was super transformative for me, and I just like, it's something that I'm very passionate about. Just bring it to as many people as possible. It's also a big part of how I parent my children. So I really see it like first-handed to see how powerful the knowledge about the brain can be on the developing young mind and figuring out who they are and how to navigate this world. If you are interested in learning about the science of the brain, and if you are passionate about self-exploration and discovering more about yourself, your brain, and your mind, I invite you to join my courses on Infijoy and to learn more about the human brain and about your own mind.